Okay, so I realize the last few lessons have probably been kind of boring. We've been extending various versions of the actor class, which is an awful lot of duplicate work, and we haven't really learned a whole lot of new Box2D concepts. However, all of that is going to change in this lesson as we finally work on making these pegs light up when a ball hits them. And so the first step towards doing that is being able to detect when two objects collide. In this specific case, we're wondering when the ball collides with the peg. We clearly need some way of detecting that. And luckily, Box2D provides us with a nice way of doing that through something called the b2ContactListener. And what is a b2ContactListener? I'm glad you asked. I happen to have a PowerPoint presentation about that. See, the b2ContactListener is a class that is used by the b2world object during its step function. In other words, when our b2world object is making all the necessary calculations to increment our physics world by 1/30th of a second, it's occasionally calling various functions within our b2ContactListener. Specifically, there are 4 functions that it calls. The first function is add. This is called when a contact is added. In other words, when two objects collide for the first time. You have 2 billiard balls, they smack into each other. At that point, a collision is essentially added, and this add function is called. The persist function is called when a contact persists. That is, when two objects continue to collide with each other. This often happens when you, for example, have one object resting on top of another. The remove function is called when a contact is removed. In other words, when two objects stop touching each other. If you have those 2 billiard balls collide and then they immediately separate, during that separation, the remove function will be called. And finally, you have the result object, which, according to the documentation, is called when a contact point is solved. I don't really know what this means, and to be honest, I haven't seen this function used a whole lot in practice. But I think it's basically, it covers situations when a contact is added or persisted. However, I could be wrong on this, so don't hold me to it. So let's just see an example of when these various functions would be called. If we take a look at, say, some theoretical example of a crate falling onto a floor, like in our first batch of lessons, our crate will be starting off like this, somewhere in midair. It's gradually going to fall, and at this point here, when it hits the ground, a contact has essentially been added, and the add function is called. Let's say our box bounces. The next frame, it's going to move up. At this point, the remove function will be called because the contact has been removed. Maybe our box flies up in the air a little bit, bounces again, an add function, and then a remove function. And then maybe, let's say this last time, it doesn't bounce. So we get an add function followed by a persist. Basically, this contact is now considered to persist because over several frames, this crate is still touching this floor. So all that is fine and dandy. We know these functions are being called at various points throughout the step function, but what do these functions actually do? Why are they being called? And the answer is, by default, these functions don't do anything. In fact, if we look at the code, this is from the code of the basic b2ContactListener that our world uses. You can see that all of these functions essentially do nothing, which might seem a little pointless. However, we can override these functions to do something more interesting, and that's generally how we use the b2ContactListener. In other words, if we have our b2world object, and we know by default it calls this very plain vanilla b2ContactListener that doesn't do anything, we can then create our own custom b2ContactListener where we could have something interesting happen by overriding one of those functions. For example, if we look at our little crate bouncing on the ground, if we wanted to play a sound effect every time the crate hit the ground, we could do that by creating our own b2ContactListener that overwrites add to play a sound. And that's basically how we could get this sound effect to happen when the box hit the floor, and it will eventually be how we can get a peg to light up when a ball hits a peg. So let's see this in practice to get a better idea of it. So here we are back in our Puggle application. And what I am going to do is I'm going to create my own contact listener. So I'm going to call it my Puggle Contact Listener. And within this class, I'm going to say that it extends b2ContactListener. Now at this point, I'm going to have it just display some debug text when I detect that two objects have collided with each other. Now I can detect that by overriding the add function. In other words, I will override, and by the way, if I select this add from the drop-down menu, you'll notice that Flash Develop does all the extra typing for me. I now have a function that can overwrite add, and at this point I'm just going to display a little debug output that says POW. I'm also, by the way, if you still have within your ball actor this offstage message happening, maybe now is a good time to remove it just to prevent our output from getting too crazy. And I'm just going to remind myself that at some point we probably want to remove this ball and give the player a new one. But I apologize, this is completely unrelated to our contact listener, so we'll close this. So now if we run this, we will see that absolutely nothing happens. I'm not getting any output. It's not detecting that these objects are colliding with each other. And that's because I haven't done the final step, which is telling the B2 world that it has to use this contact listener I've created. So let's do that by going back to Puggle, my main Puggle class, and where I've set up this physics world, and I can hit F4 to go to this function, I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to tell this world to use my new contact listener instead of the empty one that it's been using. So I'm going to take my physivals world, and I'm going to call set contact listener to a new Puggle contact listener. Now if I run it, we can see I'm getting POW statements in the output every time any two objects collide. I'm getting these statements when the ball hits a peg or when the ball hits my ramps on the side. So that's pretty neat, right? I mean, we've gotten our world to tell us when two objects collide. The next step, obviously, is figuring out what those two objects are. Is it a ball and a peg? Is it a ball and a ramp? And if it's a ball and a peg, how do we know which peg actor out of all the peg actors we have is the one that's been hit? And we will deal with all of that in the next lesson.